crude oil prices and drop in production levels have made Nigeria an unlikely holder of a slot for Africa's biggest economy. More than 60% of the country's revenue has been cut by falling crude oil prices, and that has left Nigeria's monolithic economy in turmoil. Its currency, the Naira, has been on a free fall. And just recently, the finance ministry admitted the economy has entered a recession.
In May 2023, Nigeria's new president stood at his inauguration and said 4 words that changed everything. Fuel subsidy is gone. Within days, fuel prices tripled. Within months, 4 to 5 times higher. The Naira collapsed from 460 to the dollar to over 1,600. Inflation hit a 28-year high, above 34%. And Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, fell to 4th place. This is the story of how Africa's giants stumbled. What went wrong? Which sectors are surviving? Which are collapsing? And what comes next? To understand Nigeria's crisis, you need to understand 2 decisions made in the same month. On May 29, 2023, President Bola Tinubu announced the immediate removal of fuel subsidies. The subsidy had cost Nigeria $10 billion in 2022 alone, about 24% of the federal budget. Every economist agreed it was unsustainable, but the removal was abrupt. No transition period, no warning. Fuel jumped from about 185 Naira to over 500 Naira per liter overnight, and it kept rising with subsequent adjustments. Then came the second shock. The central bank floated the Naira, unifying multiple exchange rates that had traded at massive premiums on parallel markets. For years, Nigeria had maintained an artificial official rate, while a parallel market offered dollars at far higher prices. The unification was necessary, but it meant the Naira immediately lost over 40% of its value, and it kept falling. By early 2024, the Naira had collapsed from around 460 per dollar to over 1,600. At its worst, touching 1,900. This wasn't just a currency adjustment, it was a destruction of purchasing power for 220 million people. The combined effect was catastrophic. Fuel drove up transportation costs. Transportation drove up food prices. The weaker Naira made imports more expensive. And Nigeria imports almost everything, from refined fuel to rice to machinery. Inflation that was already high accelerated to 34.8% by December 2024, a 28-year high. Food inflation specifically hit 40%. The human cost was immediate. According to World Bank estimates, well over half of all Nigerians, roughly 130 to 140 million people, now live below the poverty line. Surveys show overwhelming majorities saying the country is on the wrong track. In August 2024, the hashtag #EndBadGovernance protests erupted across the country. Unlike 2012, when protests forced a previous government to reverse subsidy removal, these didn't change policy. Tinubu held firm. Here's what's frustrating about Nigeria's situation. The reforms were probably necessary. The execution was the disaster. The fuel subsidy was genuinely unsustainable. Nigeria, Africa's largest oil producer, was importing refined fuel because its own refineries didn't work, then subsidizing it at enormous cost. The subsidy mostly benefited smugglers, who bought cheap Nigerian fuel and sold it across borders, plus wealthy Nigerians who owned multiple cars. It was regressive, corrupt, and draining the treasury. The multiple exchange rate system was equally broken. It created arbitrage opportunities for connected elites, distorted investment decisions, and made Nigeria unattractive for foreign capital. The IMF, World Bank, and every serious economist had urged reform for years. Tinubu's government argues the pain is temporary. They point to fiscal savings, over 1 trillion Naira on an annualized basis. They highlight the Dangote Refinery, which ramped up production through 2024 and could eventually reduce import dependence, though it's still not at full capacity. Official figures now show headline inflation moderating toward the mid-teens by late 2025. The World Bank praised Nigeria for decisively addressing long-standing problems. But here's the problem. Necessary reforms implemented badly can be worse than no reform at all. Shock therapy without safety nets creates instability, and Nigeria had almost no cushion in place when the twin shocks hit. Which parts of Nigeria's economy are surviving, and which are in trouble? Banking, cautiously positive. Nigerian banks are actually doing well in this crisis. The central bank raised the policy rate to 27.25%. That means fat margins on lending. The stock market posted strong gains through 2023 to 2024, boosted by bank shares and high nominal earnings. The banking sector is undergoing mandatory recapitalization by March 2026, requiring commercial banks with international licenses to increase capital tenfold. Production stays below 1.5 million barrels per day. Theft, pipeline vandalism, and chronic underinvestment. The sector contributes less to GDP than it should. The Dangote Refinery is the bright spot. It could transform Nigeria from fuel importer to exporter. But it's not yet at full capacity, and there's been friction with regulators over crude supply. Agriculture, structurally broken. Agriculture employs the most Nigerians, but it faces severe headwinds. Security issues in the north have displaced farmers. Flooding destroyed crops in 2024. High input costs from Naira devaluation make fertilizer and equipment expensive. 40% food inflation sounds like an opportunity for farmers, but most are subsistence producers who can't scale. Commercial agriculture needs infrastructure, cold chains, roads, power. Nigeria lacks all three. Manufacturing, struggling. Nigerian manufacturers are being crushed. They import raw materials priced in dollars. They sell to consumers whose purchasing power has collapsed. Energy costs have exploded. Many factories are running below capacity or shutting down entirely. This sector needs the Naira to stabilize and power supply to improve. Neither is guaranteed. Consumer and retail, high risk. The Nigerian consumer is tapped out. Real wages have collapsed. The new minimum wage of 70,000 Naira sounds like a raise, until you realize inflation ate it immediately. Consumer-facing businesses are seeing volume declines even as they raise prices. This is not the environment for discretionary spending. So, what's the path forward? The optimistic view. Reforms are working. Inflation is moderating. The Naira is still weak, but less chaotic than 2023 to early 2024. Non-oil exports grew 21% in the first half of 2025 to $12.8 billion. The Dangote Refinery could be transformational once it reaches full capacity. In Nigeria's demographics, 220 million people, median age 18, remain compelling long-term. The pessimistic view, the pain isn't over. Well over half the population is in poverty. Political pressure could force policy reversals. Security issues persist across multiple regions. Power infrastructure remains broken. And even the optimistic projections show growth around 3 to 4%, far below what Nigeria needs to absorb millions of new workers entering the job market every year. The reality is somewhere in between. Nigeria is not collapsing, but it's not thriving either. Banking and fintech are bright spots. Oil could improve if the Dangote Refinery reaches full capacity. But manufacturing and consumer sectors face a long road back. Nigeria's crisis offers lessons for every African economy watching. First, reforms require cushions. The World Bank provided $800 million for relief, but distribution was slow and limited. Only a fraction of the 15 million targeted households initially received transfers. Second, sequencing matters. A gradual approach, removing subsidies over 18 months while building safety nets, would have caused less damage. Third, credibility is everything. Governments considering similar reforms need to build credibility first, deliver smaller promises, demonstrate competence, then tackle the hard stuff. Fourth, don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. The old system was corrupt and unsustainable. The new system is painful but potentially sustainable. So, where does Nigeria stand? The worst of the initial shock appears to be over. Inflation is off its peaks. The Naira's swings are less extreme, but conditions remain very tight. The human cost has been enormous. Well over half the country, 130 to 140 million Nigerians, living in poverty. Trust in government shattered. And the structural issues, power, security, infrastructure, remain unsolved. This is what reform looks like when it's done without adequate preparation. The destination may be right, but the journey matters. Here's the truth. If Nigeria stabilizes, Africa accelerates. If Nigeria fails, the continent slows. That's how central this economy is. With 220 million people and massive resources, Nigeria remains Africa's most important market. The next few years will determine whether this crisis becomes a turning point or just another false start. Next week, Burkina Faso's $2 billion gold gamble, how one leader defied France and China, and why resource nationalism is spreading across the continent. Subscribe if you want African economic intelligence before mainstream media catches up. I cover the stories that move markets from someone who actually lives this. I'll see you in the next one.